I want to thank everybody for being here this afternoon. This is a new medium for all of us. This is a good way to get together. I hope you enjoy our program today. It's going to be very conversational. And I hope if you have questions, you'll remember to use the chat box. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of the presentations, at the end of our conversations. And if you'll put your question into the chat box, Robin will help us try to get to each one of them. So I just want to encourage you all to, as you're listening to the panel, and we have a wonderful panel, to think about those questions that you might have about anything that they're giving us information on. So the first person I'm going to introduce you to is Dr. Danny Welch. Okay, that's me. So this is Dr. Welch. We are so lucky to have him with us tonight. Dr. Welch is a PhD. He's a cancer biologist whose laboratory is most widely recognized for the contributions to understanding the genetic basis of metastasis. He has discovered 8 suppressor genes, and his laboratory is studying how the metastasis suppressor genes, I want you to say that 5 times quickly, function, and is designing therapies to take advantage of their mechanisms of action. After receiving his BS in biology at the University of California, Irvine, he got a PhD in biological sciences at the University of Texas, Houston. Dr. Welch then worked in pharmaceutical industry studying cancer biology and virology before joining the Pennsylvania State University College of Medicine. In 2002, he moved his laboratory to the University of Alabama, Birmingham. That's where I first got to know Dr. Welch and his work actually with cancer patients and cancer advocates. He is the king of working with cancer advocates. And then in 2011, he founded the Department of Cancer Biology at the University of Kansas Cancer Center. He has been a Komen Scholar. He's president of the Metastasis Research Society and Cancer Biology Training Consortium. He currently serves as the deputy editor of the Journal of Cancer Research. And this really tells you who Danny Welch is. He's most proud of the successes of his trainees, his past and present, and he's also a very strong advocate for the metastatic patient community. We are so pleased to have Danny with us tonight, and we're so pleased that Danny came to Kansas. He's been a great addition for us. Our second panelist is Dr. Jen Klemp. I'm sorry, it's not moving. Dr. Klemp has a PhD and a Master's of Public Health. She also has an MA. She is Professor of Medicine in the Division of Medical Oncology and the Director of the Cancer Survivorship Program at the University of Kansas Cancer Center. Dr. Klemp serves on a number of national boards. She's an expert in cancer genetics. And when I say an expert, I really mean expert. She was the first one I ever knew, and I am so impressed with her work and what she's done in the area of genetics. She's also an expert in survivorship and has presented her work nationally, focusing on cancer genetics, shared decision-making regarding options to manage cancer risk and survivorship issues, and the development and implementation of cancer genetics, survivorship, and navigation programs. Jennifer has been in this area for so many years and has done such great work that we are really honored to have her with us tonight. And our last panelist is Tammy Han, who is a breast cancer survivor. She presently is president of BioNovus Innovations and CEO of Clio Medicine. She's formerly served as the principal of ambulatory surgery and assistance. She was president of Nuterra Health International, and she is an angel investor. We thank her for that. Tammy is also a new member of the board of directors of the Kansas and Western Missouri affiliate of Susan Komen. thank you, Tammy, for being with us. So just a little talk about research. So why is research important to us? Breast cancer research has improved our outcomes. Breast cancer research has provided better treatments. It's given us better understanding of the disease. An example of that would be mastectomy versus lumpectomy. Many years ago, the only option for a woman or a man would be a mastectomy. Through research and dedicated researchers, they did research and found out that doing a lumpectomy could and would provide the same survival benefits for a number of women. We wouldn't have lumpectomy today if somebody hadn't done research. Sentinel node biopsy is the very same. Instead of a total node removal, they can now do a simple sentinel node biopsy. The outcomes are almost always the same, but the lasting effects of a sentinel node biopsy are certainly better than a total node biopsy. As you can see, through the rest of these bullets, research continues to improve the outcomes for the patient. I truly believe that. I've lived several of these things, and I believe that research is really where we're going to find the cures, not only for breast cancer, but for cancer. Next slide, please. So a little information on Komen itself. I believe this slide may be a little bit old. It says that Komen National's invested $959 million in research. I really think it's really closer to $1 billion today. We funded over 2,600 research grants. We funded research in 47 states, the District of Columbia, and 21 countries. Komen has also provided $2.1 billion in funding for education, screening, and treatment and psychological support programs. So that's just kind of the view on Komen National. Next slide, please. And this just tells you what Komen has done in Kansas. So we actually have at least 4 research grants, totaling 1.0 million. We have had a total of 17 total research grants for a total of 10.3 million. And we've had 10 early career investigator grants, which is certainly important. So I think that's it. We're going to go to our panel now. So the first thing I'd like to hear from each one of you, and I think it's on everybody's mind, is what has the COVID pandemic actually impacted when it comes to research? We know what it's done to the United States. We know what it's done to some healthcare. We know what it's done to the economy. But how has it impacted research itself, the thing that we're very interested in? And Dr. Welch, I'm going to start with you.
Well, and thanks also to the Komen affiliate for inviting us to talk about these things today. It's a complex answer. I'll start with the good things. Since people have been quarantined and social distancing, we've seen a 10-fold increase in the number of research papers submitted to scientific journals. And so people have not been wasting their time. Since they came in the lab, they're using that time productively to find and collect things that they've been doing for quite a while, which is good news, but it's also bad news for somebody like me as an editor, because my desk is swamped with all these extra papers. A couple of things that I think a lot of people on this may not be aware of. From the time someone submits a research grant till the time it is funded, on average, that's between 9 months and a year. And a lot of not-for-profit agencies have not decided they cannot fund anybody this year, largely because they can't do fundraising. So just if you think about that, several grants that we in my lab had out there for review, at earliest consideration will be early 2021, which means funding would be at the end of 2021. So new projects are not easily getting started in that way. That's, I think, worthwhile. And from the perspective of one of the things that we use in our lab are research animals, mice. Some institutions actually eliminated their entire mouse colonies. These are genetically engineered mice that have oncogenes in them that develop cancers. And some people work 4, 5, 10 years to make them. And those, they are gone. They cannot be replaced. They have, well, they can be replaced, but they have to start from scratch to make them. For us, we have genetically engineered mouse models that we're studying sort of the impact of racial disparities using mouse strains to mimic ancestry or race. And we had to cut back our colonies to 1 or at maximum 2 cages. And now that we're allowed to grow them back, but it takes, even mice have time, it takes time to breed and have puppies. So those are some of the impacts on cancer and metastasis research.
So I would also guess that this wouldn't be something that we would think about, because we just talked about this before we started about the effect on the mice population in your labs, but there's considerable expense. The expense of starting a mouse colony again will then use up funds that you could have been putting toward different parts of your research.
Yes. Yeah. Well, if you just think about it, for keeping animal models, it's about $1 a day. And that, you know, you think that's not so bad, but then you multiply that out by 500, 1,000, and the time,
Right.
it's going to take 6 to 8 months to come back up to the size we were in February.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Welch. I think those are things that maybe most of us might not have thought about. Dr. Klemp, are you seeing, Dr. Klemp, are you seeing consequences of areas of concern, not only at KU Cancer Center, but maybe across the United States with other colleagues that you talk with?
You bet. I think the biggest challenge has been since March of really cutting back on the number of treatment trials that we have access for our patients. So we've cut back on phase 1 trials, which are, you know, the trials where they're a little more intensive, the patients are a little sicker. We've cut back on quality of life and supportive care trials. So the big challenge has really been giving our patients options for those who want to participate in clinical trials, because they just don't, we've had to shut them down temporarily. And then you're going to have to pick up that momentum again. You have staff working from home or flex working. So maybe we have one research coordinator covering on a day, and they're covering, you know, 30 trials. So I think the hardest part is you scaled back very rapidly, and now we'll have to try and sort of phase in and scale up. And that's really going to be challenging. And not to reiterate what Dr. Welch said, but, you know, a lot of the challenges for getting funding, we've had grants that were funded through a national organization that basically then they came back and said, hey, you know, our fundraising is down. We're going to have to redirect for this year. So I think that not only is it challenging for the patient, for the researchers, and then for funding, but it really is going to slow down our progress. And, you know, you can read things that will say it's slowing down our progress 2 years to 10 years. And I think it's not until we get a little further out that we'll know the true impact, but it really is kind of impacting every element of research, from patient to advocate to organization to researcher. So it's really challenging.
So are you seeing fewer people come into the clinics too? Are you seeing people afraid to come into the clinic?
Oh, for sure. There's patients who are afraid to come into the clinic, but then there's also patients who, because maybe they're at lower risk or higher risk, we're keeping them home. So for instance, if a patient could be seen via telemedicine, we're going to quickly pivot that so that they could be seen virtually. But if it's also a patient who really has a lot of risk factors, we may try to stretch that out longer so they don't have additional exposures. And then you have patients who are just flat out scared. You know, they just don't know. They have heard so many things. And, you know, we live in this infodemic right now where, you know, fact checking is up and there's so much misinformation out that it's really caused a lot of patients to live in fear. And some of it's real, but a lot of it's not. And so that's really prevented us from being able to care for patients appropriately as well. And then screening's a whole nother story, right? We've
Right.
had some sessions trying to get patients back into their normal screening behaviors, and that's going to take a while. And it's hard to risk stratify even though we want to, because we want to get those highest risk patients in, but we just need to get patients in because we're so far behind in regards to breast cancer screening, colon cancer screening, and so forth.
Okay, I think that's one of the things that we don't think about is people being afraid to come back into the clinics and what it's going to take. And you did touch very quickly on telemedicine. I know you've done telemedicine for a long time since you were in Kansas City and you had so many contacts across the state, but you are seeing an uptick in people being comfortable having a conversation with their physician.
Absolutely. And, you know, I had the opportunity to do an ASCO discussion and was able to sort of highlight not only genetic testing kind of models, but also talking about geriatric assessment. And one of the things that we've seen is a new kind of caregiver model where it's a distant caregiver. So let's say you're in Wichita and your mom's in Hutch, but you're still her caregiver because you're her closest and sort of that advocate. So what's happened is maybe mom would go into the clinic or maybe she would still be on telemed, but you would be conferenced in via telemedicine. So we're seeing a lot of new alternatives, which I think is great. And yeah, I've been doing telemedicine for over a decade. So, you know, for me, it's just allowed me to see more patients and their families. So I do a lot more family counseling instead of just patient counseling. And then testing companies, which I know we'll talk about too, are really being helpful at getting things to patients' homes so they don't have to go into a clinic either.
Yeah. I think telemedicine is here to stay if we can get it covered by insurance. So that's a whole nother conversation about getting it covered by insurance permanently. I know it's covered for a short time, but we need to make sure that that happens. So Tammy, I'm going to turn to you. You're kind of in a different world than Jennifer and Danny are, but how's your world actually changed because of the COVID pandemic?
Absolutely, Peggy. Our world has changed. BioNovus Innovations, we invest in technologies and we advance those technologies, any translational research to the patient. So because of the funding that both Danny and Jen talked about, through our doors, we have seen a lot of companies, startup companies, or even academic institutions that have asked for grants or opportunities to financially support them. So that is on one side of the house. On the other side, Cyclamed is a small biotech, and we are advancing a technology that we actually licensed out of KU. And in that particular organization, we're in a phase 1 clinical trial. So for the very reason that both Danny and Jen talked about, phase 1 clinical trials often have been shut down. And so in our particular organization, we did have a reduction in accrual of patients. Mm-hmm. And of course, with that reduction in accrual in phase 1, you can't complete that portion of your trial and then move on to phase 2. So it's been a significant impact during COVID.
Right. And are you seeing any opening up since the state has opened up some? Are you seeing any changes? Is it still as bad as it was in March and April? Are we seeing some better times?
Well, I think fortunately, what has happened is the technology that may have been there for quite some time, and as an industry, we've been resistant to adopt the technology. We've all embraced it. So as an example, I'll speak as a cancer survivor. Right. I've done remote visits with my oncologist, and it's worked out beautifully. In fact, it's saved me so much time that I think I'd like to ask if we could continue that. So it is opening up. We are when you're a sponsor of a clinical trial, typically you use a clinical research organization, and that entity will monitor your clinical sites. Historically, what has happened is somebody gets on an airplane and they fly to your clinical site and they sit in a room with an individual, and they go over documents and they walk around the facility. Well, what has been happening is remote monitoring has been adopted by the industry, and it improves efficiency significantly. So I do think what is happening is it's opening up because we are embracing technology.
That's really good to hear, because I know those visits can be stressful. And so if you can scan all your documents, send it to them, and be able to talk to them in real time, that sounds like a really good advance. I'm sorry it took a pandemic to get us there. So thank you. So I'm going to move the conversation now to one of my very favorite things in the whole world, and that's talking about breast cancer research. I've been in the Komen world and the breast cancer world for over 30 years. I'm an 8-year survivor. I've seen all the things that research has been able to do, and so I really am anxious to talk about research. And so, Danny, I'm going to ask you to go first again, and tell us about the successes that you're seeing in the laboratory, that you have seen in the laboratory, and would you also kind of concentrate on the successes that you're seeing and challenges that you're seeing for the metastatic breast cancer patient. I think everyone is interested in that. It's something that we haven't talked about. We didn't talk about for a long time, and obviously now it's front and center. And so could you just tell us, I know this is where you're the expert. So could you just tell us what you're seeing in your labs?
Sure. Well, I have been doing metastasis work for now going on 40 years. And there was a stigma associated with patients who said they have metastases. In fact, I liken it to the way cancer was in the 1950s or even early 60s, the C word. Even today, there are people who have difficulty saying they have the M word. So that's the good news, is that seems to be less stigmatized than it was. But you know, the survival is not good for patients who have metastatic disease. A couple of things. I think it's a bit of a pivot, but I had the privilege of working on a grant by a group that the NIH is funding called PCORI, or Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And someone gave up a research grant on this topic, and I thought it was ridiculous to give it up. And they allowed myself and Jill Peltzer at the KU Cancer Center to take over this grant, and the focus was on patient outcomes in metastatic cancer, not just breast cancer, but all cancers. Mm-hmm. And a couple of the things that were shared by the group, and I think it's important to know that the research community and the clinical community are listening to those things, because they weren't necessarily before that. The number one thing that was said by everybody in the room: we don't care just about having more life. We want a good quality of life for whatever life we have left. It's not just enough to live years longer if that's a miserable existence. Another was the importance, and I think that everyone who's listening will appreciate, is palliative care. And I know Jen can speak a lot to this, but for years and years that was equated with hospice, and it's not. It's improving the quality of life during care, and even after the care has been administered and people are cured. There are things that happen because of the chemo or the radiation and so on. And research in the last couple of years, I've been excited to read. They're doing lymph node transplants now to help women who've had their lymph nodes removed, and so they don't have the awful existence of lymphedema, and even doing transplants of the vessels. And that's being done now in a couple of clinics in Europe, which I think is really cool to hear about. Another thing, and this is something my lab focuses on, so I was excited to see it come from the patient perspective as well. What has been appreciated in the last 8 to 10 years, because research seems like it's moving at a glacially slow pace, but we're building on top of a lot of other knowledge and have to take that into account. We've all heard of patients with different kinds of cancer who were diagnosed 10, 20, 30 years ago, who had no evidence of disease, but then suddenly the cancer appears in another organ. And what that means is sometime during that interval, those cells were there in another tissue, like the brain from a breast cancer. And what those cells had laid dormant during that time. And the last handful of years, people have been focusing on what are the mechanisms that keep them in that dormant state, because quality of life wasn't bad during that time. People thought they were cured. But what is it that keeps them dormant, but also what is it that releases them from that checkpoint? And if we can figure out how that happens, then we can prolong that. And then I just want to add one more research thing that I think is really hot right now. And in fact, next week, KU Cancer Center is sponsoring a meeting on this for the Midwest Tumor Microenvironment meeting. And what that means basically is tumors don't exist in isolation. They're surrounded by blood vessels that are feeding blood to them. They're taking away nutrients. There's structure there, the collagen that's there. For a long time, Jen and I have been doing this for enough years. Cancer is a genetic disease. The genome, the DNA is screwed up, but that's not the whole story. It's how the tumor cells interact with all the cells that are supporting them and things. And that has been a greater appreciation and understanding how those things take place. I could go on and on. There's a lot of cool stuff taking place, but I think it's important just to share there has been progress. And I think I want to emphasize researchers like me in the lab are listening and learning from the patients to try and focus the research that's going to most impact patient life and quality of life.
Dr. Welch, that is so important, because I don't think we talked about that or heard about that for a long time. And I do appreciate you've been a wonderful advocate for getting the patient's voice and listening to the patient, and making sure that the treatments are not only beneficial, but they don't cripple the patient to not be able to enjoy life. I'm just going to tell you a very short story. I have a good friend who's a very, very strong cancer advocate. And she was diagnosed about 22 years ago with stage 1 breast cancer. And 2 years later, she was diagnosed as metastatic. She is still here today after 20 years. Anybody who's on the chat today or knows anybody who is metastatic, this is a success story, because she was diagnosed 20 years ago. She's been on 16 different treatment regimens, but each one she was on, she tolerated or kept her alive until the next one was discovered, that kept her alive till the next one that was discovered. And I think about her almost every day and everything that she's been through, and she's probably the most happy person I know, but she is a strong advocate for research because she is the example of how research keeps our metastatic friends alive. So I thank you for your research and your passion, because I know it does a lot. Jennifer, I'm going to switch to you last because I'm going to ask Tammy to tell us. You told us a little bit about how being a breast cancer survivor has affected your work. Have you got any other examples you'd like to share with us, whether it's with research or in treatment?
Absolutely, Peggy. I have participated in research studies, and part of that is because I'm in this environment, but other friends, family members, individuals that I know that have also been diagnosed and asked to participate. I think as a patient, not only do you look at what can I do to save my life, but what can I do to contribute to the body of science, which is going to save other lives. And so for me, I was fortunate to be asked to participate in a radiation trial, which I did, and look forward to seeing the outcome of that, because it should inform the protocol for radiation treatment in the future. That's one example. Also, lymphedema, as Dr. Welch was just talking about, it's the quality of life.
Yes.
So lymphedema is a big issue for women. And so I'm also part of a lymphedema study group and participate in a clinic where there are machines that can actually analyze whether or not you're developing lymphedema before you can actually see it in the body.
You know, I've heard a number of breast cancer patients, breast cancer survivors, tell me that lymphedema was much worse than actual being diagnosed with breast cancer and the treatment, because lymphedema is with them forever. And good for you for being in that group, because lymphedema is one of the things that we don't talk about. That's why sentinel node is so important to me, because we can eliminate a lot of lymphedema through sentinel node. So I'm happy about that. But that's great insight. Thank you. We appreciate the things you're doing. Thank you very much. So Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you because let's talk about genetics a little.
Sure.
I know that genetics are, that's how I got to know you, because you were the only one in Kansas who could talk to people about genetics. But would you kind of tell us if, I know the idea about doing genetic testing is changing.
Right.
I hope it's changing with patients, and I hope it's changing with physicians. So could you talk about that?
You bet. So if I can push pause for 1 second though, because I think I should share, I don't always personalize, as you guys know, but I feel like the lymphedema story requires a personalization real quick, because we do have someone at KU who does the lymph node transfer. And how I know this, obviously, those of you who know me, is I have a mother who's 26 years out now from her diagnosis, and that's how I got into the field I'm in. But she had a lot of positive nodes. She had very advanced disease when she was diagnosed, and did a clinical trial when they were doing transplants. So fast forward 15 years after her diagnosis, she develops lymphedema. And so she is getting prepared to be one of the early patients to do the lymph node transfer at KU. So I'm very pleased that we have such an amazing surgeon who can do that at KU, Dr. Butterworth. And, you know, I thank goodness every day. When my mom just saw Lori in our survivorship clinic, and she can't thank us enough that she jokes that I built her a clinic, but indirectly, I guess I built her a clinic, and it keeps her happy with her quality and quantity of life every day. So jumping into genetics feeds into that, because I don't think we can really risk stratify patients appropriately for treatment, for screening, for their family, if we don't offer them genetic testing. And with guidelines changing so rapidly, we can't just say, oh, well, you should just be referred. There's an expert you should talk to. And 40 to 70% of patients don't end up getting seen by the expert. There's a drop rate for a variety of reasons. So genetic testing has now become a single indication. And what I mean by that is you don't necessarily have to have 3 family members with cancer to qualify for testing. You could be a triple negative breast cancer under age 60. You could be a woman with breast cancer who's in their 30s, you know, in their 40s. So there are so many patients who qualify for testing, and it's currently estimated that we have over 1 million women living in the United States with breast and ovarian cancer that have not been tested. And one of the things that I put as a chart, and I'd love to share this with all of the folks with the affiliate, is I put together a table showing that, you know, if you estimate the number of positive patients every year that we would have, taking current statistics for the incidence of breast cancer, you know, we should have about 45,000 women a year who have either DCIS or a new invasive breast cancer who actually are at hereditary cancer risk. So that means we have to be testing pretty much every patient that's newly diagnosed or anyone who's a survivor. So when you say, Peggy, that we need to kind of, it's not just a little bit of a paradigm shift. We need to be empowering our patients. We need every provider to be comfortable with genetic information and how do we access testing. And then because we only have a handful of genetic experts, you know, we're lucky to have genetic counselors. There's a handful of different institutions around the Midwest. We have to use them as genetic experts, because if we wanted them to see, you know, 1,500 breast cancers a year or, you know, 500 colon cancers, that's a huge volume that a handful of experts isn't going to be able to accommodate. So I think that what I've always proposed is sort of democratizing genetics so that it can be accessible. It's now very affordable, and every insurance company covers it, including Kansas Medicaid and including Medicare. So there's very few barriers. Now it's just the human barrier or the pathway barrier. And that's something I feel like we can all work on together.
So I always think about, there has to be the first one. There has to be the first one in the line of hereditary breast cancer, because it started somewhere. So it's not, there has to be the number 1 patient. And I think about how many of those number 1 people and what testing would do to help people coming behind them. Maybe simplifying this, but you've taught me so much about genetics and how important it is. And I hope that physicians are beginning to understand that that's one of the things that they need to, especially young women, when they're diagnosed, that they really need to go through genetic testing.
Well, and part of it's how you frame it, right? So when we talk to a patient, whether they're a new patient or a long-term survivor, we need to be able to put it into context. And I think that sometimes just takes a little more time than what people are comfortable with. So we're trying to retrain. We have our first training this fall of what we're calling genetic extenders. So those are nurses and navigators where we can empower them to be part of the team to help facilitate that. We train providers all over the state through telementoring. So we're trying to help fill that gap by empowering those care teams. And we can't work in isolation. This is definitely a village that has to work together to accomplish this. And it does start with that first person. And I always tell people, you know, when you're the first one tested, you're providing a huge gift to your family, whether you're positive or negative. And not only does it help us take care of you and hopefully extend your life, but it also will help us empower your family, because prevention is hard, as we all know. And knowing that there's a genetic mutation in your family and knowing you have it or you don't have it really is such a amazing gift that a family can have, so that they can hopefully prevent future cancers.
I agree. I'm so proud of the work you've done, and that you're at KU and you're still here. So we're at the 15-minute mark, and so we're at our Q&A. I want to thank all 3 of you. You've given us such good insight into the work you're doing and the work that others are doing. So I'm going to turn it over to Robin, and she's going to start us into the Q&A.
Thank you all so very much. So At this time, I think that we just have one of the inquiries, and that is from Carol, and she is saying, will remote capabilities offer the potential to expand trial participation to a larger geographic area?
So I'd love to jump in and grab that one. And Tammy, I think you probably have some insight too. You know, we have these cooperative groups in cancer that allow us to collaborate with other sites all across the country. And one of the ones that we're part of in KUN across the state is SWOG, which is the largest of these cooperative groups funded by the National Cancer Institute. And I happen to be one of the founding members of what's called the Digital Engagement Committee. And that's how do we use digital technology in clinical trials. So one of the things that we are helping investigators do from the get-go now is to build technology for video consenting. How do they do symptom management from home via telemedicine? So we're helping them build that in from the get-go versus trying to retrofit like we're doing today. And so I do think not only is it amazing how fast we had to pivot and retrofit, but in the future, these will just now be standard parts of clinical trials. And I'd like to know if Tammy, if you're thinking about those kind of things too.
Absolutely, Jen. We are embracing the technology, and we think for a number of reasons. One, as a patient, the convenience of the technology. So even if you're a rural individual that lives in the rural community and wants to participate in a clinical trial, it affords you a little more flexibility in your consent visits and in follow-up visits. So we think that that is helpful in patient accrual. And then, of course, it's just the efficiency of the provider as well. So if I can do a remote visit and immediately go to the next patient, it improves provider efficiency. And we know that it's difficult to find enough providers to to help all of the patients that we have, especially in the rural communities.
And
So-
if I can chime in briefly. From the research side of things, I mean, and I'm talking basic research, there's something that Komen has been funding for about the last 6 or 7 years called the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance, that is actually asking people from around the country to donate saliva or get a tube of blood, and especially for metastatic patients, so that they can begin to put together what are known as these cohorts that allow researchers like myself to test things that we find in the laboratory, but they're also identifying subsets of patients who respond better to therapy and are directing them towards clinical trials. So that's something that the affiliate is funding. All the people who are donating to Komen are actually funding that.
Well, and I think Dr. Welch, you bring up a good point that we have, I mean, it's not even sort of an afterthought anymore. It's part of all the research that we think about, which is precision medicine. And when you think about developing those cohorts or the subtypes of breast cancer, there are many types of breast cancer. 20 years ago, you had a one size fits all. We don't have one size fits all anymore. And that's amazing, but it's going so fast that's where precision medicine, getting individuals to donate, having researchers in the lab who can help us better understand, and then translating that to the clinic. So I feel lucky that we have such a great environment in our backyard to be able to do that. And we have some amazing breast cancer researchers from bench to bedside, truly right in our backyard.
So, and sorry, Peggy, it just sort of, these comments are just spurring a couple of extra thoughts. We talk about genetics, having certain mutations that lead to the development of cancer and that type of thing. But some new things that are coming out, again, this is one of the priorities for Komen's research program, is dealing with health disparities. So we know that African-American women develop a subtype of breast cancer called triple negative breast cancer at higher frequency. And some of the work that several groups are doing are looking at genetic differences that are between the races that predispose to getting cancer. And within the last year, there have actually been genes that have been identified, not only to developing triple negative breast cancer, but also whether those metastasize or not. There are layers upon layers. It's like peeling back an onion, and you don't want to cry with all that detail, because most people on this call cry when they think about the complexity of genetics. But there are smarter people than me working on it, but there is progress there.
So I want to go back to one of the things that Tammy said, and it's kind of it's one of those things that I feel is very important, in that it's in clinical trials and it's the informed consent process. And Tammy's talking about that they can now do it through telemedicine, and the consent process is so important. And I could see, Tammy, where it's actually going to be a better process doing it through telemedicine, because number one, you could take a little more time, and maybe the patient will feel more comfortable at home asking questions than they might if they were in the testing site or in a doctor's office. Do you see any of that?
Peggy, that is a great point. And we haven't, I guess we don't have enough experience yet to know whether or not patients feel more comfortable in that remote setting versus face-to-face. I do believe and strongly that when a patient goes through informed consent, it's about the relationship they have with their provider. Absolutely. And so the level of comfort they have of asking questions, I don't really understand. I trust you, but I don't really understand what this means. But as we have more patients go through that remote process, we'll have a better understanding of the patient's perspective.
Right. I think it's good that you're being able to at least do that part, so that clinical trials isn't coming to a screeching halt. That you're able to do it through Zoom, conference, whatever. That was one of the things I feared the most, and Danny did talk about this, and so did Jen, that we can't let something like a pandemic, because there's probably going to be another one, and we need to make sure that we can keep research going and we can keep clinical trials going, because clinical trials are so important. Tammy, you're a great example of this, that clinical trials are where we learn so much, and the research actually, the rubber hits the road. We find out if the research is going to be successful. So, Robin, have we got any other questions?
So I do think one more thing, Peggy, in regards to that telemedicine and consenting. One of the things that we've been working on too, and we've been using a group of advocates at KU called Pivot, which are patient advocates, to help us. But we've been developing videos that the investigator does that goes through the study and the consent. So as you know, you would have a lot of different people as study coordinators, and especially because there's fewer people available real time, we put together small videos where we can talk about the trial and then go through the consent. So it standardizes the message, but also the patient can still feel sort of connected to the person leading that research. And so we're collecting feedback to see, do the patients like it? Do they learn enough? Can they ask questions? So I really think this is a time for accelerating how we use technology, and we can't just depend on that as the only solution, but I definitely think it's helping us standardize some of those processes that have been barriers for a long time as well.
I agree. Thank you, Jen. I want to thank all three of our guest panelists today. You've been wonderful. I see the comments coming up. People very much appreciate your time and the information that you provided. I'm going to give a little call to action here. I'm actually going to say one big success is that Missouri passed Medicaid expansion yesterday. Erica and her team and I have for a long time been advocating for Medicaid expansion. We haven't gotten it done in Kansas yet. And now Kansas is surrounded by 4 states that have passed it. So we should be embarrassed in Kansas, but hats off to everybody who was out advocating for Medicaid expansion. It is so important, especially now, because so many people have lost their jobs and lost their health insurance. And so it's going to be so impactful for Missouri to actually have Medicaid expansion. And I want to encourage everybody, if you live in Kansas, stay with us so that we can get it passed in Kansas. Hats off to KU for all of the work that they're doing, all the research that you're doing, the patients that you're impacting. Thank you so much. Oh, there's Roy Jensen. Thank you, Roy, for being on the call today. Thank you so much. I'm impressed that you're here. The other thing is, if there's anybody on the call today who is interested in becoming an advocate in science for Komen, I would encourage you to apply. It's a wonderful program. You get access to lots of webinars. You get access to people like Jen and like Danny to learn about research. When we get back and we're reviewing research, you can become an advocate reviewer on a review panel, which is probably one of the most rewarding things that I've done in my career. So, and we want you to all stay with Komen, Kansas, and Missouri, because Erica and her team are increasing our impact. Carol Bush is doing a great job of finding those pockets where we need to be. And my hat's off to them for keeping the Komen fire going, because it's so important. I'm going to sign off. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you for giving us your time today and getting work for this. And thank you all. Thank you all. Robin, do you have anything else to follow up? Oh, save the date.
I do not. Thank
Go
you
ahead.
all so very much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you attending, and we will continue more of these wonderful conversations, these impactful conversations and very relevant conversations again on our monthly town hall, which will be Thursday, September 3rd. So we hope that you can join us then, save the date, and look for more information to come out soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.